So today's presenter is Professor Sachin Shetty. As you all know, Sachin is a site lead at Old Dominion for the CREDC project. He is the Associate Professor in the Virginia Modeling Analysis and Simulation Center at Old Dominion University. He holds a joint appointment with the Department of Modeling, Simulation, and Visualization Engineering and the Center for Cybersecurity Education and Research. Sachin earned his bachelor's in computer science from the Mumbai University in India. He completed his master's in computer science from the University of Toledo and got his PhD in modeling and simulation from Old Dominion. Sachin's research interests lie at the intersection of computer networking, network security, and machine learning. So with that, I welcome Sachin and hand over the mic to him.
Thank you, Rowan. So the title of today's talk is Proof of Stake Consensus Protocol for the Cyber Supply Chain Data Provenance. So this is the work that was conducted under the Assured Cyber Supply Chain Provenance project using blockchain. So this is one of our first efforts in that project. So I wanted to start off with the problem that we are addressing. So before I get into why blockchain, I'll talk about what is the problem that we're addressing and why we feel blockchain would be a good solution to address this problem. So essentially the problem is how do you come up with a methodology to provide cyber supply chain provenance. So the idea is that if you have your products developed and delivered by third-party suppliers and vendors, how do you ensure the integrity of those products in the procurement phase and also during the operational phase? How do you make sure that the frequent updates and patches that are being done are done in an integrity preserving fashion? So provenance makes sense because the definition of provenance is how do you track the changes that take place on your specific, in this case, product, and it could be any entity, from creation to the current state, or if that is a terminating state too. So it's definitely not a new problem. So it's been addressed by several other techniques. So there have been works on side channel fingerprinting, reverse engineering, and there are also several formal methods, and I'm pretty sure there are some ongoing activities within CREDC also, where this problem has been addressed. So what we have noticed is, and again, based on my interactions with some of our industry collaborators, the solutions that are currently being used are not necessarily scalable. And I forget the industry collaborator, but this specific industry collaborator was very much interested in finding out if that is a scalable solution, which doesn't operate at the chip level, but at the integration level. And so we took some of those inputs from our collaborators to find out what would be a solution that does provide this assured provenance and does so in a scalable fashion. And finally, and this is the key piece, that when the provenance is violated, can you get near real-time tracking? And I am hoping that the work that we are conducting and the eventual prototype that will come out of this will lead to that conclusion. Because if we don't get to that point where we can get near real-time tracking of any provenance violation, again, we got defined at what granularity we can achieve that. So that needs to be also assessed. And also the cost that you incur to get to that. So that's the goal. So how do we come up with this cyber supply chain provenance framework? And we are proposing a permission blockchain platform to achieve that. And so the work started around 6 months ago. And so I'm going to be reporting the results that we have acquired so far. So in terms of the entities that we are tracking in this cyber supply chain framework, so in this figure, as you can see, we have the station of operators who are responsible for, in this case, receiving, transmitting components, physical hardware components, and software core that are delivered by vendors who are responsible for manufacturing of those entities and end user who rely on the consumption of the services. So it's a tall order because there are so many aspects that need to be monitored. What we want to find out is whether we can achieve that at a certain level of granularity, and if we cannot, if we can identify at what level of granularity we can track the provenance and provide the tracking. So quick overview of blockchain. Some of you may already have that, so I'm just going to quickly run through this, but focus on why we chose blockchain and why we cannot use existing blockchain platforms as is. Why is there a need for R&D? Because you probably heard of several blockchain platforms, both in the public blockchain manifestation and permission blockchain manifestation. So why do we need to do additional R&D to support this use case? So real quick, the technology is nothing but a distributed public ledger, which can be used to record transactions and allows the delivery of this transaction in the distributed network. And that network can be a peer-to-peer network, however you specify it, and we'll come down to later. But the goal is that this network doesn't have a centralized arbitrator. So, and you will see in a lot of the implementations of platform that we have noticed is that the altruistic notion of not having a centralized notion has been modified in the different platforms that we have seen, where you don't necessarily see a centralized controller, but you see some sort of centralized control going on when they have to support specific use cases. So we have also fallen into the pitfalls where we were designing this protocol, and I wanted to address the challenges we had and how we overcome some of that. And finally, the immutability piece, which is already baked in. The fact that you cannot modify the contents of the ledger once it's validated and entered, which is the integrity piece already baked in. So definitely there's not much you can do. However, the immutability is can be under attack depending on where the ledger is stored. So Bitcoin is a very popular example of how blockchain became popular, where the entire platform was in a public infrastructure. But if you're going to move the infrastructure to a private network, the immutability is of concern, whether you can keep that immutability assurance true. And finally, consensus. So that's the focus of this presentation, where we will talk about how you need to have consensus among the participants to update the ledger and what are different protocols to achieve that. I already talked about the infrastructure, so the reason I brought this up is we have also been debating internally in terms of, even within the community, there's a lot of debate between whether you would choose a permissionless, that means a completely public blockchain platform or infrastructure, or you come up with a permission blockchain infrastructure. What we have noticed is that there has to be some middle ground of having completely permissionless, where you have no idea who is going to be participating. It's definitely not a way to go to support some of the use cases where the data that you're tracking is of has a level of sensitivity attached to it. But when you have permission blockchain, how do you make sure that you will not revert back to some sort of centralized construct, which you will notice a lot in some of the platforms that Microsoft and IBM have been promoting. If you dig closely, you'll find out that they are dependent on some centralized either a process, a protocol, or a control mechanism, which is required to minimize some of the attack surfaces. So when it comes to consensus protocols, I will, because that's the focus of the talk, I want to quickly give an overview of the state of the art with the consensus protocols. So Bitcoin has been heavily using the proof of work consensus protocol. The challenge with proof of work is, at least in Bitcoin, it takes 10 minutes on an average to come to a consensus, and also uses a lot of computation power. So it does suffer from high latency. So after proof of work had those challenges with latency and energy, proof of stake was proposed, where you do not necessarily need to consume a lot of resources, but you have to define stake, and I will get to that when I talk about our protocol. The different definitions of coming with the stake and the one that we chose, which we believe that will overcome some of the computational challenges with proof of work. Byzantine fault tolerance is another variant. So this was pretty much a work that was proposed 15, 16 years ago. There's a lot of variants. So the difference between BFT and proof of work, proof of stake is where you're leveraging the networking resources to achieve consensus, whereas proof of work, or to some extent proof of stake, depend on computing resources. So which resources would you depend? So if you were to use Byzantine fault tolerance, you better expect that the network, underlying network on which you depend on to achieve consensus is more reliable. If the network suffers from a lot of failures, then the performance will be affected, the latencies will increase. Several other protocols, you can definitely look this up. I just wanted to present this over here because even though proof of work, proof of stake, and Byzantine fault tolerance have been already proposed, there have been a lot more recent work going on, especially to address the energy consumption problem, because there's been a push for using blockchain for constrained computational resources, improving the scalability, latency, and throughput, and the cost that is incurred per transaction is still pretty high. And how do you address that? And finally, resilience. So how do you make sure that if you are going to be dependent on computing resources or a reliable network, that you will be able to update the ledger even in presence of failures? So this is a quick rundown of the existing work. So that's all for the background of blockchain and some of the important elements that are key to the work that we are doing. So under this project, we have a couple of thrusts, but in one of the thrusts where we want to come up with this blockchain empowered cyber supply chain framework, there are two aspects to this. One is the application aspect, where we are going to come up with architecture. The second is a protocol that will be the underpinning of ensuring that this particular framework, its resilience, its scalability, and the different properties that we desire are maintained. So that's our hope, that in lockstep, we will develop the framework, we'll work on the protocol, and we'll integrate that into one of the existing blockchain permission platforms and make it available for the community to test it, validate it, and that's the process that we are looking forward in this project. So the key aspects of the framework is first of all, what entities will be participating. I already talked about the system operators and users and vendors. What are the processes that we'll be tracking? As I mentioned, we are looking at provenance. So where does provenance start? So for us, it's looking into the procurement phase, where you're looking at the vendors who are going to be involved in supplying the software. So how do we prevent the vulnerabilities or threats resulting for procuring and utilizing these different vendors and suppliers, especially given that they're all most likely third party and in some cases reside overseas. So how do you make sure that vendors are providing certified products? And we can ensure that if that's not the case, the provenance, the tracking of the provenance is detected. The second piece is the operational phase. So once the system is operational, how do you make sure that when vendors are performing remote troubleshooting and are trying to are about to conduct updates or patches, that they're indeed working on the product that they should be working on? How do you minimize attack surface? How do you ensure the access control? And all these aspects would be taken care of within the blockchain platform. In terms of attack surfaces, there are two in particular: the manufacturer source code and the vendor remote access. So the manufacturer source code is how do you make sure that if there are any variations to the code, whether it's the software or the firmware, how do you detect it? So we have certain ideas of how to do so, but how do you realize this in a scalable fashion is something that needs to be looked into. And the vendor remote access that happens in the operational phase, how do you make sure that the remote access, the access control that comes with it, the credentials that come with it, would also be tracked within the blockchain. So this is the use case that we eventually created this framework for, and I will quickly go over the key components of this framework. So the key components, you look at this figure, you got two layers. You got the cyber supply chain layer, and you got the blockchain layer, which I'll get to later on. But if you look at the cyber supply chain layer, we're focusing on three main aspects here. First is identity registration, so which is the identity for each participator in this in the cyber supply chain framework, and to generate a unique identifier and make sure that we can have some sort of management system where the identity is not compromised. Again, it's a huge problem. Some of the aspects of identity creation are beyond the scope of this work, but we are focusing more on the identity management within the blockchain layer. The second piece is the record tracking, which is the provenance of the processes in the procurement phase and operational phase. So how do you have those records tracked and anchored to the blockchain network? And this is a tall order because the challenge here is that how do you define your transactions? So all those operations that take place, how do you determine which of those operations get encoded into transaction? What is the thought process? Are you going to track each and every process activity, or are there specific process that we track? Are you tracking the state change? So making sure that the amount of tracking is kept to an optimal number so that you can balance between the resilience and scalability. And finally, the contract execution. So if you have well-defined rules of what is allowed, what is not allowed. So using smart contracts, you could have detection of malicious activities, which is when if you had a specific design and you modified it based on tracking the hash values, that would be detected. And if you had some aspect, so when you detect it, we'll also provide alert. And this is what I was talking about. How quickly could you provide the alert? How timely is it? In terms of the infrastructure, and this is where I'll come down to the protocol that we're using. So currently, we are making this assumption that the cyber supply chain processes will be deployed in a cloud environment, especially in the federated cloud environment. The reason we wanted to use the federated cloud environment is that yes.
I may interrupt you. I already interrupted. Sorry, but can I ask a question before we get into the details of this?
Sure. Sure.
So from what I understood so far, different parties or organizations along the supply chain can track. We can track through which parties it went, and perhaps use blockchain as a way to capture this information and in a way that it cannot be modified. But how do we force them to, for example, if somebody makes changes, I mean, if they're good actors, obviously they'll put the changes in. But if obviously somebody is trying to make changes that they don't want to be seen, I mean, how do we enforce that all the changes are recorded? So you have a way to say that the hash of the software has to match with the hash that's stored in the chain, or what?
Yes, that's the mechanism. So the goal here is that we do have to agree on that's an issue. The design that you have and the hash that comes with it, that needs to be agreed on, and that once it's encoded, you cannot go back and change it. So if you change the design later on, and then we compute the hash, and that doesn't agree with what was agreed upon, that's how you detect the changes.
Okay, thanks, Sachin.
Okay, no problem. So we again made this assumption, and again, this is not set in stone. This is primarily for us to come up with the implementation of our platform. So we use this federated cloud environment, and especially we use federated cloud environment, as I mentioned to you earlier, that most of the blockchain implementations after a while end up looking like a centralized infrastructure. So we wanted to go with a federated cloud environment just to make sure that we had enough resilience. And one of my biggest concerns was that if we go for a cloud-based service, what role the cloud service provider would play, and that would also bring about some sort of centralized type of construct. So again, use the federated cloud environment where no single cloud service provider would have unanimous control of the resources and on the processes to influence the process in any other way. So I'll come back to the protocol because the protocol uses the cloud environment heavily. But in this slide, I just wanted to demonstrate how the eventual implementation of the system will happen in cloud, and that's where the blockchain ledger and the consensus protocol will be executed. I already talked about these two phases, so I can probably go through it real quick. So in terms of the procedures, as I mentioned, there are a lot of these aspects that require R&D, and I don't believe that in this project we'll be able to get to that. For example, the identity establishment. So one thing that Rakesh just said, that he was talking about how do you track vendors who want to modify the design. But what about vendors who would like to do that but change their identities while they do so, while they appear like new vendors? So that comes down to the identity establishment. So that's an open problem. We have some ideas of using combination of public and private key, but then there are challenges as with regards to the initial process of how do you register the identity. So, but we have identified the procedure, but still there is a lot of R&D that needs to be done. The product authentication verification, this is something that Rakesh talked about. So the hash algorithms will be used to detect the changes. The challenge over here is that we're expecting that the vendors would have, the assumption is that they would have the ability to generate the hash, because they are not going to share the source code or the firmware. So we have to figure out a mechanism to where the firmware and source code that they plan to use, the hash to be generated and will be inserted into the blockchain, so that they feel comfortable in participating in this process. The access control management is specifically for the operational phase, where the vendors need access to the systems to make updates and patches. And the whole access control can be addressed within the blockchain platform without needing any explicit Active Directory services. So if folks are using Active Directory to do so, you can basically mimic the same process within the access control piece, and having smart contracts to make sure that those access control rules are executed, and that goes into the contract negotiation execution. Finally, the logging and monitoring. So this has been a big challenge for us, because some of the things that we also want to learn is how much logging we need to do. What are the things, what are the aspects that need to be recorded? We know that we would record the hash values of the designs, but in addition to that, what are the things that needs to be recorded and stored into the chain? So I want to quickly go into the consensus protocol design. So there are three aspects that we realize that we need to work on. One is efficiency, which is what I've mentioned about. We want to have the near real-time tracking. The second is the security piece. So depending on where you deploy the blockchain solution, whether it's a public, private, or hybrid, how do you ensure that it will be resilient to node failures and network failures? Because that's the whole point of having using blockchain, that it will be able to perform in an acceptable manner, even in terms of failure. So how to quantify that? And finally, scalability, and that comes down to the cost. So what would be the investment in resources? And that's one of the reasons why we decided to choose the cloud infrastructure, so that we can have a handle on the cost of using these resources. So I'm now going to make segue into the meat of this talk, where we decided to go with proof of stake consensus protocol. Again, we are this was our first attempt to come up with a protocol that balances all the criteria that I mentioned earlier. And again, when we started this work a few months ago, most of the proof of stake work was implemented or proposed in a cryptocurrency context. We wanted something that would work in a distributed system context, and at that point in time when we started the work, there wasn't a whole lot of work, and so this was one of the few works that addressed the problem of how do you come up with a proof of stake protocol for with using distributed system resources. So as I mentioned, we had to make sure that the proof of stake protocol doesn't appear like another proof of work, where it is using up a lot of resources and having the same issue with validation time. And we wanted to ensure that what would be the process for this validating nodes to propose a stake. And so I will define the definition of stake in the few slides. And the next challenge was how do we make sure that we can utilize the resources optimally and in energy efficient fashion. The third piece is the reward, and this was a big challenge we had, and I have another slide on this. Why would the vendors and the cyber supply chain participators even consider participating in this protocol? What would be the reward? In Bitcoin, it was pretty apparent. Money was the reward, so you would get tokens or coins as a reward for participating in a consensus protocol. But we chose not to go down the road. Now, again, we are exploring other economic incentives, but right now we are choosing a different strategy. I will talk about that, but the incentive piece is definitely an open problem and something that I wanted to also learn more from the industry folks to see. Would the participants be interested in committing some resources to ensure that the provenance of their cyber supply chain activities are tracked better? So would they be expecting a reward, or they'll be okay with everybody staking their resources? And finally, attacks on the consensus protocol. So something that my group is also very cognizant of is that we don't want to introduce blockchain as a solution and add new attack surfaces. So the idea is to minimize attack surfaces or add. So while we are proposing this consensus protocol, we are mindful of the fact that if there are attack surfaces that could emerge, so for example, validating nodes, which could be compromised, or we are talking about a cloud environment. So what are the possibilities of attacker using up resources just to impact the consensus protocols processes? Which brings me back to the threat model. So especially given the fact that we used the cloud computing environment, where if you are going to use cloud computing resources to implement your cyber supply chain, the provisioning of those resources can never be predicted a priori. So you don't know how many resources will be available. So at any point in time, the validators that we are depending on to provide the consensus may appear or disappear as and when the process is going on. So how do we incentivize the participants to make sure that they would ensure that there will be some validators who would always be participating and be responsible for adding the transaction to the ledger? And finally, if the validators, and this is the attack surface piece, that how do we make sure that the validating nodes are not driving the consensus towards malicious activities? How do we track their activities? Because if there is a reward attached to anything, you could bet that there are nodes who would maybe gaming towards improving their rewards. So how do you make sure it's fair and the probability of manipulating the process is minimal? So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we came up with the idea of defining the stakes. Again, given the fact that we are using the cloud computing perspective, so we decided to use the computing memory and network resources as the means to define stake. And that is the tuple that is proposed here. And we also added a greediness parameter that would help incentivize the user, the validating nodes, to ensure that they can, they feel like they are not only staking the resources, but also reaping the benefits of participating in the consensus process. So I talked about the incentives for participation. So if there's, so how do we make sure that the validating nodes will indeed participate? So how do we ensure that the incentives are clear, and who provides the incentives? So we had gone back and forth on how we would define this incentive. So one of the ideas was, if you are going to use a cloud service provider, the cost of leasing resource could be managed or could be a reward. And so there are a lot of different models that could come up with. Would the reward be the amount of resources that is credited to account with the reward fees, the transaction fees that could be managed better. So how do we make sure that participating in this consensus protocol works for everybody, or making sure that there will be enough participation without malicious activities? So there are 5 key phases in the protocol. The first phase is the stake determination. So we wanted to come up with the definition of the stake. So as I mentioned, the definition of stake is tied to the resource, which is the computation, memory, and storage resource. And so we also came up with the greediness parameter, which is weighted some of the 3 components. That do you want to stake your computing resources, memory resources, and networking resources? So that was our initial model, and the idea was that the stake components for this validators would change over time as the consensus progresses. So the resource amount would also change in a temporal fashion. So that's why, in order to make sure that we are calculating the stakes properly, we use the average value at the beginning of the epoch and kept it fixed throughout the epoch. The next phase is the resource staking confirmation. So even though you would determine the stake, we want to make sure that after you estimate the resources that you're going to stake, that you'll indeed follow through. So we have to lock in the resource. So there could be a tendency that, and this is what I was talking about, some of the pitfalls that you could come up with a centralized process to make sure that once you've taken the resources, you will be following through and you won't back out. And so again, a lot of ways to achieve that. You could have a centralized process, or if you do a decentralized process, then that's the process that we chose. Then what we have to do is the validator does instantiate the virtualized resources, and we have to restrict the access, again, using the shared secret key. So you could use threshold encryption for encrypting the secret, and the decryption of the secret could be under the collaboration of the validators or something called a membership service provider. So the reason why we came up with not only the validators membership service provider is that we wanted to ensure that the group of validators don't game the system and go rogue in terms of whether they want to stake or not stake. So we wanted some sort of some entity that would ensure that the stakes are locked in securely, and there will be no backing out once those stakes are put in, because if you don't commit it all the way, then the process won't work. The next process is the leader selection process. So the idea here is that the leader's responsibility here is to add the block to the chain. So the challenge over here is that how do you come up with the selection of the leader? So you could make it as a function of the resources that you stake, but we also have to make sure that it is fair, and the people who always the validating node who always has the highest stake doesn't end up being the leader all the time. So I don't have all the details of the process, but this work has been done a number of times in the past. So we used a timing-based voting approach that was proposed in one of the earlier works to make sure that the leader is selected based on probability distribution. And what we wanted to do was that probability distribution is going to be a function, but it's a random-based timer approach. So the random-based timer approach is based on the stake proportion in the system. So after the timeout event happens, the validators send out a request for a vote, and the receiving validators perform the check, and then after every epoch, they can then decide who the next leader will be. And I have some results to show that one of the concerns that I had was to make sure that the leader is not going to be the same node every time. And so we definitely went through the process and have some results that verify that exact scenario. So once you have selected the leader, the next step is to make sure that you have the single leader, you don't have more than one leader. And the leader has the rights to now include the block or transaction, and all other validators should agree on that fact. And so the validators create the transaction block at the beginning of the epoch. So that preserves the order of transactions. So that's another big challenge, making sure that the transaction order is preserved, and the validators would ensure that. And finally, once you have done that piece, you go down to the reward piece, which I mentioned earlier about the incentive piece. So the incentive could be the one of the reward functions that we chose in this work was trying to give back the resources that you staked if you are successful. But there are several other options that you could use. So this is the algorithm that summarizes what I shared so far. So the stake determination process, where you define how many combination networking memory resources you would allocate. The stake allocation, which is then locking in those resources. Then the verification to make sure that what you determine is the one that would be staked in. The leader selection, selecting the leader who is ultimately responsible for updating the blockchain. Then broadcasting the block to the other peers, and then the propagation of the block. So this is all done in multiple epochs. So what you see over here is a procedure that is run by a single validator node at the start of the epoch. And obviously, you can do more optimization where right now the stake allocation and verification all occurs at the beginning of every epoch, which is a bottleneck and something that we do recognize. And one of the things that we are working on is where we can relax that and still achieve the result, because what we're trying to achieve is the stake allocation has to adjust to the resource utilization dynamically. So we wanted to see where you could overcome that process by enforcing that the validators take the resource for a fixed amount of time. So we were trying to make sure that we would, the epoch process was taken to make sure that we would have the resources available. But you can modify that by changing the epoch construct to having a fixed amount of time. And you could use a smart contract to make sure that you can prohibit release of those stakes before the agreed staking time. So once you say that a fixed amount of time you're going to stake it, then the smart contract will make sure that you will not be able to release it. So that's a modification we plan to do, because we do recognize that the epoch-based process that you see over here it can indeed be a bottleneck, because you're always waiting for this the epoch time to go, because you can only execute those steps at the start of every epoch. So while I'm talking about this, we are also modifying this process and coming up with the smart contract example that was talked about to relax the need to have this slotted mechanism. So we did eventually we do want to deploy this in a permission blockchain platform like Hyperledger Fabric and other similar platforms. But we went ahead and created our own platform to begin with, so that we can compare this with Hyperledger Fabric later on. So we came up with our own test bed using a cluster of machines managed by the Zen hypervisor. The elasticity piece is provided by Kubernetes, and we use Dockers instead of virtual machines for the containerized services. That was the infrastructure where we deployed the proof of stake protocol. For the performance evaluation, again, we were focusing on looking at the validators stake. We were looking at the leader selection, also focusing on network latency. How much does that affect the leader selection process? And finally, the time it takes to add the block and verify the transaction and the stakes. So in terms of the metrics, one of the metrics that we were mostly interested in was the amount of time it takes to select a leader, because we were coming up with this randomized voting time protocol. And we didn't, as it's obvious that the more nodes you have, this time is going to increase. And we wanted to find out, again, that's also an ongoing research that's going on in trying to figure out how many nodes do you need so that you can balance the trade-off between getting the resilience that you need and also doing so in a real-time fashion. Finally, and also number of times the leader was selected and did not have the highest stake amount. So this takes care of the fairness principle. So we didn't want, if you know that just because you're going to stake more resources, you'll end up being a leader all the time, that could de-incentivize the other nodes. So we wanted to make sure that the leader that was selected was not just based on the fact that you always have the highest number of resources. And finally, the amount of time it takes to extend a blockchain with a new block. So we wanted to make sure that it was in milliseconds so that we can get to the real-time tracking. So some of the results that you see over here, the first thing that we wanted to see is the average time to extend the blockchain with a new block. And as I mentioned, it's obvious that as you increase the number of peers, the amount of time it takes to extend the blockchain definitely increases. So we did notice the time increasing from the 10 peer nodes to 25 peer nodes. So, and the left-hand side figure is without network delay, and the right-hand side figure is when we had some sort of network delay that we added. But again, it's not comparable because, again, in this results, the number of peers are not the same. So we plan to rerun this simulation to make sure that if the number of peers are the same, how much the additional delay that you would have would affect. It's obvious that the time it takes to extend a blockchain will increase when you have additional delay. This was a key thing that I wanted to make sure we could address, that number of times a new leader is selected. So what we found out was that essentially we wanted to see if the leader is selected from the minority stakeholders. So we did see that more than 50% of the time on average, they do end up being the highest stakeholding validator. So it's not necessarily the case that you have the validator with more resources. But however, the higher the stake you have, the chances of becoming leader still remains high. We're still working on this process to make sure that there is decent amount of fairness, because this leader selection process also ties in with the incentives, because if the validator nodes don't see enough rewards, and that also comes down to what is the reward process. Is it becoming a leader, or is it getting a good bang for the resources that they're staking? So it could vary. If the validator nodes are more interested in making sure that they get good bang for the resources they stake, and they see that the fact that they're staking resources and they're seeing improved resilience, that could maybe a positive thing for us. So the ongoing work that we're doing, so what we have seen so far is our proof of stake protocol, which again, most of the work is from a heuristic perspective. We haven't done the formal analysis of the protocol yet. So we wanted to address a lot of those questions that I mentioned, that the incentive piece, the leader selection piece, the number of nodes that you need to have, and the amount of stake that they need to stake. Is there a way we can come up with formal analysis of the work, so that if somebody were to instrument a proof of stake protocol, how would they identify the infrastructure needs? So having some formal work would help influence that process. We do plan to implement the prototype in Hyperledger Fabric and provide some metrics. At the same time, we're also working on a simulator, which would help the different stakeholders to figure out how to engineer the blockchain solution. So, and these are some of the questions that we had, and we believe that the simulator would help. Why would you choose between a public, private, or would you do a public and a private? Which of the consensus protocols work best for this use case? So we do have implementations of all the protocols that are listed over here, and we want to compare them and show the performance and security metrics for all these protocols, so that for specific use case like this, what's the best instrumentation of platform, protocol, and the number of nodes that you need, the bootstrap time, which is the time it takes for a new node to learn or to load the ledger, and finally the resilience. So, for example, business fault tolerance depends on reliable network to update the block in the blockchain. So, what would happen if half the network is unavailable? So, how resilient are you? So that is and so we have a couple of publications in the work. So the work that I presented today is going to be appearing in SecureCom later this year. And some of our Provenance work was published at CC Grid last year. So we leveraged the work that we did on the Provenance work, and then we added proof of stake protocol to that framework. That's all I had. Any questions?